Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and people online. It's 9 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I think possibly by reading the titles and things, and a little bit slowly, so you can still get to your computers. So this Global Wildlife webinar is about conservation enterprises integrating conservation goals into development projects. So if you're, check your boarding pass. If you're on the wrong flight, you should change to another flight. We'd like to ask that you keep your microphones on mute and your videos off, because if you talk while your video's on, the camera will immediately switch to you and will catch you doing whatever you're doing, drinking coffee or something. We don't have any coffee here, so it's a sad story. Be nice if you could keep your phones off. That one's hard to enforce. I may not actually be able to follow it, but it's nice if we're in the meeting all together. So we have about an hour and a half, go to my other notes here. Megan Hill is an environmental protection specialist at USAID. She's going to start off the introduction of the presentation. And Judy Boshoven is a program officer at Foundations of Success, which is leading the Measuring Impact Project program for USAID. Should we introduce everybody in the room? I'm Tim Brown. I'm a natural resource management specialist in the global part of the environment division of the World Bank. So I work in parallel with the GWP people, but I actually work on other things that have different names and acronyms, which we could go into or not.
We don't have to do.
You don't do introductions? No. It's not more intimate? All right.
Too many people online.
Too many people online. There's only 25 online. Anyway. Okay, so welcome to the seminar, and let's get started. I think Megan is going to start.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Hasita, for this opportunity to present what we do in conservation enterprises. It's really my pleasure to be here to share this work with you. And also I wanted to give a great shout out to Dilys Rowe online. She's actually a lot of the inspiration for this work, and I'm very happy that she's able to join us as a discussant. And also to say good morning to Rebecca Butterfield, who I saw online. She used to work with our team and was really an impetus behind measuring impact at the beginning and also for this work. So thanks, Rebecca. I'm glad you could join us. You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
I also wanted to call out Jason Houston was a photographer that worked with USAID in one of the products that you'll see later on in the webinar. And so a lot of these photos are credited to him, and I think they really illustrate the work that we've been able to do. So I'm just going to start out with some basic framing about why conservation enterprises and why the learning group. Judy's then going to go over the activities and products today, and then we also teed up some discussion questions that I'd like to hear from you guys on. So at USAID, we have something called the Cross-Mission Learning Program, and that really had 4 purposes, if you want to just click through them really quickly. One of them was really at the heart of the reason is we want to be able to make sure that we are doing effective conservation programming, which sounds like that should be obvious, but I think we all know that conservation ultimately deals with humans, and humans are complex creatures, and sometimes our interventions don't always have the impact that we think that they're going to have. And so this is really the impetus of why we do this. But we also wanted to focus on the most common strategies in USAID's biodiversity portfolio. When we started this program, we did a quick analysis and found that at least 25% of our interventions used an enterprise approach. But as we'll see later on, there wasn't always any assurance that it was actually conserving biodiversity in the end, so we wanted to go a little deeper. We also wanted to engage USAID staff and really took a participant-defined learning agenda approach, because we wanted to be able to harvest their learnings and experience from the field rather than just small little bits of pieces. So we really focused on engaging USAID staff, and this is one of the first times we've presented publicly, not the first time, I'd say 3rd or 4th time we've presented a lot of this work publicly. And that was really because Hasita says that she's a nerd and really likes our documents. So she was the one who wanted to invite us to share what we've learned with you along this theory of change approach that we'll also go into. So conservation enterprises, I think sometimes terminology can be our biggest barrier. And so conservation enterprises, just to frame what we mean when we say that, if you want to go ahead and click through, Judy, they're often part of larger community-based natural resources management program. Also, they're a subset of alternative livelihood strategies, which is also a very common term. We find that sometimes these approaches can be linked or unlinked to biodiversity. And just to say what that means, ecotourism is obviously something that's directly linked to conservation, but maybe some of the handicrafts or basket weaving might be a little less linked directly to the biodiversity that they're trying to preserve. So that's what we talk about there. So they produce goods and services, often from nature, generate income from stakeholders, which is often the primary purpose for a lot of interventions, but also they motivate conservation behaviors and then ultimately conserve biodiversity. And go to the next slide. So Dilys, who will talk more in depth at the end as part of our discussion, worked with people including USAID's office, Diane Russell, to do a systematic review of alternative livelihood projects. And it included 21 projects, ultimately 18, which included what we consider conservation enterprises, and really looked at the evidence around outcomes related to attitude change, behavior change, threat reduction, and ultimately conservation outcomes. And at the end of the systematic review, there were only 8 projects that really could produce evidence of having a positive outcome on conservation. And another finding was also just that people weren't collecting the information, and so you couldn't really tell. And so that really set us out on to our next initiative, next slide, which was to define what we meant by conservation enterprises. And so we worked to define what we consider our theory of change behind enterprises. And we all know life is not linear, and activities are not as linear as this simplification is. But basically, when we've seen conservation enterprises strategies, there's a whole set of enabling conditions, and there are a lot of them, actually, more than 20, like 21 different enabling conditions. And that would be things like, is the policy framework correct? Do people actually have tenure and ability to actually use and the resources to begin with? Is it, or the communities that you're working with, or the people working with, do they understand business? Because ultimately this is a business. Or even, is there access to markets? Is there transportation? Is it going to be profitable at the end? So that's like the first set of outcomes that we look at. And there's an assumption between that and the benefits generated, and also who gets those benefits? How are they distributed? Are they able to exclude outsiders, or are they fairly distributed? Does it cause conflict in the community? That's a whole other set of outcomes and assumptions that then lead around that arrow with the 3 is a big assumption that will then lead to attitudes and behavior change, which is another assumption, and 4, that threats will be reduced to biodiversity, and that will lead to conservation. Mm-hmm. So somewhere along this chain, the magic happens, right? And we invest in conservation enterprises and we conserve biodiversity. But we really wanted to take a look at all those assumptions and all those outcomes in the chain, and that led to a large body of work. And when I say we, I really mean Judy. Judy has done all of this work. And so now she's going to just do a quick summary of all of the products that we've produced to look at these assumptions and kind of what we've learned today. So Judy, over to you.
Great. So I'd like to thank Tim for the introduction and Hasita for inviting us here. It's a great opportunity to talk about our work. As Megan mentioned, I'm going to quickly review some of the products, and we hope that you would go online, and if you put in USAID Conservation Enterprises, you'll get right to a website that we have that I'll show you, and you can take a deeper dive into these resources that we've been producing over the last few years. So the first thing we did was a synthesis of key lessons from assessments from many projects. And so you can see from this list, USAID has, over 30 years of experience, or about 30 years of experience in implementing conservation enterprises. If you look at the dates, there's like 50 years of collective experience in these. And these projects, activities are basically just the sort of global programs. They're not the programs that happen at the country level, at the mission level. Right? And so we basically started off by doing a synthesis of these reports to outline our basic theory of change, define conservation enterprises, and outline our theory of change, and to glean any findings we could from the documents produced from these USAID activities as a starting point. And then the next step was to develop a learning agenda, and so based on our findings from the desk review of all those USAID documents, we defined conservation enterprises, which Megan reviewed with you, and the theory of change, which she also reviewed. And then we outlined our learning questions, and I'll show you that our learning questions are framed around our assumptions and our theory of change. We defined some learning approaches. Do we want to do continue to do a retrospective look at what has happened with conservation enterprises? Do we want to think about doing maybe prospective analysis, meaning, let's think about things that we can measure in our projects that are active now and going forward within a time frame? So we had several options there. And then we listed our activities. We decided on our activities for the first phase in this learning agenda. So as I mentioned, we developed these learning questions, and you can see they're aligned with the assumptions, examining deeply those assumptions in the theory of change. And Megan already alluded to, we're not only asking, from USAID experience, were these outcomes achieved, but after you answer if they were achieved, or not, your next question is why or why not, right? And so what are the conditions which supported achievement or lack of achievement of these outcomes along our theory of change? And so that's how we were framing our learning questions. Right, and I mentioned the learning platform we have. It's a website, and as I already mentioned, all of these documents are posted there that I'll talk about, and other resources as well that we thought would be useful to the conservation community who are programming conservation enterprises. And we'll continue to post relevant documents on this platform. So then the next report that we developed was actually based on Dillis's systematic review. So we took the 18 studies that seemed to fit the definition of conservation enterprises, those studies that were assessing a conservation enterprise approach, and we looked at the evidence for each assumption in our theory of change. So basically in the systematic review, they were looking at, does the intervention lead to attitude, behavior change, threat reduction, change in status of biodiversity conservation? We were trying to see if actually some of those assumptions in the theory of change, the relationship between them, held.
That's okay. Keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. And then the next effort was to draw on recent published assessments and guidance, so not only within USAID, but also outside of USAID, and synthesize those conditions that influence the conservation outcomes. And so you just see, when you're looking at all the guidance produced for an enterprise approach to conservation, kind of repetition in these conditions. Some of them Megan already mentioned, like having a financial management system, having a benefit sharing mechanism, so having the rights of the resources as inputs to the enterprise. So you start to see a pattern here developing when you're looking at these resources, that there are certain conditions that seem to be supporting conservation outcomes. And we developed this based on keys for success. In those conditions, we developed this sort of checklist where if you're programming conservation enterprises, you're considering that, you can kind of run through this simple list of questions and decide whether this is an appropriate approach and whether you're considering all those necessary conditions to make it lead to those conservation outcomes over time. It also tests your logic along the theory of change when you run through these questions, right? And then this was another effort that's relevant to the World Bank. So Andres Gomez looked at project evaluations and trying to do an analysis that looks at what's the evidence based around the attributes of integrated livelihood and biodiversity conservation projects associated with achievement of social, economic, and conservation outcomes. He didn't find a strong association when conservation and other sectors are combined, livelihood sectors are combined, that there is a strong evidence for outcomes, but it is a very interesting report to look at and see how he constructed that analysis as well.
So can I just ask, I mean, I don't know if you like interruptions, but just to go back one, is there some evidence of impact on social and economic, but not conservation, or? Well, that's at least reassuring.
He did.
I
So
see this
when
nodding.
there
so.
are,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, from what I read, basically it said that there was just no indicator that was measuring biodiversity, and so as a result, there were no activities that went all the way through to find out if that livelihood actually had an impact on whether biodiversity or wildlife populations.
So
or
some of
poaching.
it is potentially lack of impact, and some of it's
Yeah.
lack of measurement.
Lack of reporting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Lack of measurement or lack of reporting. Similar to Dillis's findings on
Yeah.
conservation enterprises, right? We're not measuring these things.
We're not measuring right stuff.
Exactly. We're not
Okay,
measuring the
got
right
it.
stuff. Right. And then last but not least, we did a retrospective analysis, 20-year retrospective analysis based on 6 conservation enterprise approaches that have lasted over that period of time. They have had continuous support, external support over that time as well. And it examines, again, those conditions that we found in the literature and whether they have supported the sustainability of conservation outcomes over time. And I'm going to take a little bit a deeper dive into the findings of this particular retrospective.
So you're going to name names. We'll know who they are.
Name names of the...
Name names. Right.
Right. So, again, our question was what conditions contribute to the achievement of conservation outcomes along our theory of change. And so for this first assumption, are the enabling conditions in place to support a sustainable enterprise? As Megan mentioned, there's a very long list of conditions here that seem to support having a sustainable enterprise in place over the longer term. And you'll probably, these will probably all resonate with you, right? One thing we found is that these enterprises were supported by conservation organizations, and a lot of times initially they didn't have the business savvy to be able to help support these enabling conditions. And so they evolved over time, developed that capacity or sought capacity as needed. And I'll just give...
Should I make an announcement?
I need to just find it. There are 80 people online, so I have to just scroll up. And
Somebody online is not muted, and we're getting a lot of banging of drums, so we'd like to have you check that. If you're not muted, okay, thanks.
So I'm just going to give one example of one condition. You'll have to look at the reports in order to get all the lessons from the different conditions that were important to enterprise establishment. But this is work of Natropal and Palawan Island in the Philippines, and they've been supporting indigenous peoples organizations for the last 20 years. And it started with just supporting under the Biodiversity Conservation Network of USAID for people's organization. Now it's an alliance of over 60 people's organizations. And they're still today working on establishing clear rights over the resources as inputs for their enterprises. So they include rattan, almasiga resin, and wild honey that they collect from their community managed forest. And still today it's very difficult for these people's organizations, indigenous people's organizations, to get the annual permits from the government they need in order to sustainably harvest the rattan and the other resources. So that's just an example. Even after 20 years, they're still struggling to get resource rights, clear resource rights, as inputs to their enterprise.
But they've done something that keeps people engaged for 20
They
years.
do.
So the local people see some benefit of being involved.
They do. Yeah.
Okay. And I just wondered on these evaluations, we'll come to this later, but the idea of a project might be 5 years or 7 years, and you do an evaluation, but the impact of the project lasts
Might
for
be
20
longer,
years.
right.
So I don't know how we capture that.
That's why we
true.
did it.
That's a big. That's why
But
we
you
did
guys
the
are looking back
retrospective.
20 years.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
got
why
it.
we did it,
Good,
because
thank you.
a typical, and that's one of our main findings. In a typical funding cycle of 3 or 5 years, you are basically seeing whether you've established the basic
Right.
enterprise, right? You don't
not
have
looking
the
for
opportunity to
longer-term
measure, and that's one of the
benefits. Okay.
challenges that we have, right?
But just the idea of being able to attract support for 20 years is some indicator of success.
Right.
Or either really good rhetoric in writing proposals or some impact on
I
the
think
ground,
that
right?
they're having some impact on the ground, and that's why they're having incremental success on the ground, and that's why they continue to get support. So, an important condition for the second assumption in our theory of change regarding the enabling for the enterprise leading to benefits for stakeholders is that there needs to be a mechanism for the distribution of benefits among the stakeholders that's perceived as fair, right, among the stakeholder groups, and that can be a challenge. And so an interesting case of this is around Chitwan National Park, the community forestry user groups, and this is in Nepal. And the community forest user groups decided to distribute the benefits from their ecotourism enterprises as in kind. So they gave cook stoves. You know, they got the income from the enterprises as a community organization. They distributed cook stoves that are run on biogas, and so they're distributed to every member of the community, and in that way, the benefit itself is linked to reducing the threats to the forest. And so instead of collecting fuel wood, they are using biogas to.
But also
for
women's
fuel
health,
wood.
right? The women in the
And,
kitchens
yeah.
would see the benefits in terms of smoke quicker than they would see the benefits in the forest, right?
Another benefit, a non-cash benefit from the enterprise as well, the health benefits. Good point. Okay, and then in this third assumption, we found that the type, distribution, timing, and frequency of benefits is important to consider in terms of whether they're changing attitudes and behaviors, and there needs to be a strong linkage between the enterprise benefits and those behaviors. So it's good to be able to clearly define the behaviors, the conservation behaviors that you want to see as a result of this approach, so that you know how to link them to the benefits, and that other supportive strategies like law enforcement or even awareness building, formal education can be important supporting change in attitudes and behaviors. Right, and so this was an amazing interview. So these two men live around Burundi National Park in Uganda, and they have both been involved for a long time in conservation efforts around their community members, and they've been involved for a long time in conservation efforts around the park. And they both agree that the livelihood approaches are really important to getting attitude and behavior, supportive attitudes and behaviors for protecting the girls around the park. But they disagree on the approach to law enforcement. And so one believes that it's essential and people should understand the rules by this time and they should be clear. The other believes that law enforcement has been inappropriately applied to some members of the especially marginalized community members, and that they should really focus on the livelihood and awareness building approaches and not so much on law enforcement. That was very interesting. So it just goes to show how behavior, supporting conservation attitudes and behaviors can be very complex, and even within the same room you can have two different very strong opinions about the appropriate approach. And then the last assumption is about the scale of, is about do the attitudes and behaviors lead or contribute to threat reduction. And key conditions here were obviously the scale of the conservation behaviors that you're able to achieve through an enterprise approach, and that there's a need for other supportive strategies as well in achieving your desired threat reductions towards towards biodiversity conservation. So you can imagine a lot of these efforts are still at a very small scale, right? And so the behavior change is still at a very small scale, and therefore the threat reduction is still very minimal, what you can perceive, right? So I wanted to end with this example. This is a great photo, and it was really amazing to be here at this moment. So this is the Carmelita Cooperative. They have a forestry concession within the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in Petén, Guatemala, and they are celebrating 20 years of being a community forestry concession. And it's sort of a bit, she's being crowned the Princesita of the celebration. And it was bittersweet when I interviewed the president of the cooperative. He was proud to be the first cooperative within the reserve to be celebrating 20 years of being concession, but he also knows that they only have 5 more years until their contract expires. And so they're very nervous because there is no guarantee at this point that their agreements will be renewed by the government. And so the Rainforest Alliance, supported by USAID, has worked here for a long time, and they actually did an analysis, produced a report that showed that the deforestation rates within the community-managed forest is lower than in the government-managed forest within the reserve. And so they're hoping that this kind of information produced in a clear way will help support the decision to continue to renew the contracts, the agreements with the communities for the forestry concessions. So we just in July we held an event, a session at the Environment Officers Conference held by USAID, and we had this learning exchange, and it was really amazing because I worked with the different activities in the missions that are actually implementing a conservation enterprise approach. And we had 12 case studies. We could have had much more, actually. There were a lot more. So it just goes to show how important this strategy is. And so we developed these case examples, and we used our theory of change, or generic high-level theory of change, to show what the specific assumptions were in the context of these projects, what they're measuring and how they're measuring it, and key lessons to date. And so you'll see, then we had a discussion of this. We developed a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework that we're hoping to pilot, and we wanted to review with them the relevancy of that framework and feasibility of using it. So here's one of the posters that was produced out of the 12. This one's for Nepal, and you'll see that they're doing an impact evaluation, and so they are more rigorously measuring their outcomes along the theory of change, and this is going to be really important information to have, given the findings from Dillis's systematic review, to have these findings, and it's a great investment by USAID to do this impact evaluation. They don't yet have lessons learned because the evaluation is underway, and it's a long-term evaluation as well. And here we have Guatemala, and they actually have been measuring along their theory of change all the way to biodiversity outcomes and have key lessons that they could discuss in this learning event. And then here's a third one. It's chili growing in Uganda under a different activity. It also includes beekeeping, and they're definitely taking a lighter approach in what they're measuring. It's a lot based on perceptions and key informant interviews, but they are still documenting key lessons that they found along the theory of change. So this is just a way that these different activities can, mission staff can share both the framework that they're using and how they're measuring things and key lessons on using sort of the theory of change as a backbone, right? So I'm just showing a portion of the MENL framework that we're developing so you get a feeling for it. So it's going to be pretty simple. We want to keep it simple, like the checklist. So basically we're saying, is this your desired outcome along your theory of change? Define the outcome in more detail. Here's some suggestions, recommendations for what you can measure. And these are some ideas for how you can measure it. All this comes from these ideas that are represented in this MENL framework, come from all the background work that we have done to date. So this is all based on our findings, really, and these seem like key things that you could measure and along the theory of change to contribute to the evidence base for this really important strategy. So just to wrap up, we feel like this learning approach is demonstrating a learning process using a common theory of change, sort of again as this backbone, this framing of ways to share lessons learned, and contributing to cross-project learning about the effectiveness of a common strategy. And so then we propose some discussion questions. Should we go there? Should we have those first?
Well, you can show them so people are looking
they
at
can
the
think
thing.
about
They can
them
look
as
at
we-
it.
okay.
This is being broadcast.
Oops, I went too far again. Go back.
So, okay, thanks very much, Judy, for a really interesting presentation. I like the theory of change kind of was the thread that pulled everything together, and you kept coming back to it. I think that helped people really get the information. And I like that you explained the pictures, because when I flashed through it before, I didn't know
What are
the
these
pictures were
about?
there. Now I realize those are the people who are getting the benefits from the project, so that's great. I have a question about what's the uptake in countries, and you mentioned that you were trying to get environment officers, I guess, to understand this information and build it into the designs, which would be what we would like to do in the World Bank. So let me just put that question out there and then turn it over to Dilys. And sorry I didn't introduce you earlier. Dilys Rowe is principal researcher and team leader on biodiversity and natural resources at the IIED. And she's online and obviously has, I guess, followed this work or invented this work in the past. So it'll be great to hear, Dilys, what you think about the presentation and where the work has gone, and any ideas you have for discussion questions that you'd like other people to get involved in. And then after that, we'll turn it over to people online, and Hasita is your point of entry, I guess. You're sending comments and questions to Hasita. And then after we hear from people in the field, then people in the room. Okay, so Dilys, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Great, okay.
Can people, yes, great. Just
We can hear you
people
very
can hear
clearly,
me.
so that's good. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to be a discussant on this really interesting presentation. I had a number of points that I wanted to pick up on. The first is that it's great that systematic review that we tried to do on alternative livelihood projects provided an inspiration to do so much more by you guys on conservation enterprise and all the various learning that's come from that. So I'm quite amazed by the number of publications that you've managed to produce and the learning that you've managed to extract, both from that study that we did, but from all the programs that USAID has funded and the other sort of enterprise type schemes that you've managed to look at. So huge congratulations on that. I think it's a hugely valuable resource. So the first point I wanted to make was one about evidence for conservation interventions and the paucity of evidence for lots of the interventions that we do, and the paucity of monitoring and evaluation. I think, as you pointed out in our initial study, we looked at 22 alternative livelihood projects. Obviously, there have been hundreds and hundreds that have been implemented around the world, but trawling through the literature, it was really hard to find examples of projects where the implementer or the evaluator or the researcher or whoever is writing up the paper that we were looking at has actually sought to look at the outcome and look at the evidence. And so trying to find initiatives where there's been a documentation of what happened and what the outcome was is really difficult. My colleague Francesca Booker and I have done a similar exercise looking at community-based projects to engage local communities in tackling illegal wildlife trade. And again, it's remarkable out of the hundreds of things that we know are out there, how few interventions are well documented, well monitored, and the outcomes of them are there and clear to see. I think that's a, sort of a major failing on the point of our conservation community, that we haven't been that brilliant at documenting what we do and measuring and evaluating the outcomes. The second point I wanted to make was around enterprise as an approach. And I think, as Judy said, if you think back to the enabling conditions on that theory of change, one of the basic enabling conditions for an enterprise is that you have to have a market for the thing that you're trying to sell, the product on which your enterprise is based. And most of these interventions are implemented by conservation organizations who don't have business skills. They don't necessarily even think to look for a market for a product. They just think, oh, here's a really good idea. We need to generate some income for this community. So let's have a honey project or a brick making project or something like that, without actually thinking who will buy the honey? Can anybody get here? How will we get the honey to market? How will we actually make that work? And I think tourism is an absolutely classic example of this, where so many conservation projects try and introduce tourism element without thinking through, would tourists go to this place? Can they even get there? Is there an airport anywhere nearby? Are there roads? Is it 16 hours on a boat down the Amazon River to get to this location? When they get there, will there be water for them? Will there be food that they're prepared to eat? People just don't think through issues in the way that a professional tourism developer would think them through. And then they wonder why they fail. So I sit on the advisory committee of one of the UK government funding schemes for biodiversity, the Darwin Initiative. And when we're reviewing proposals for that, we're always on the lookout for any proposals that plan to introduce some kind of enterprise component or other type of livelihood support component. And we particularly scrutinize those and try and understand the assumptions that are behind that, particularly in terms of markets and so on, and particularly when tourism is involved. And if there's no tourism market identified or tourism operators involved in the project, then you can generally expect them not to work, and tend to be a little bit suspicious about those kinds of projects and really scrutinize them in detail. So I think this whole notion of enterprise as an easy win is a myth which definitely needs busting. So I think, going on to my third point, I think the theory of change approach, which has been used here, is a really good way to do that. If you kind of think back to the theory of change that Megan and Judy showed in the presentation, and it seems quite a logical, straightforward set of steps. You do your intervention over here, and 3 steps later you get to your conservation outcome over there. The things that are absolutely critical are the assumptions that underpin each of those steps, as the presentation tried to make clear. And some of those assumptions are really, really obvious, like, is there a market for this product? Are the right conditions in place? Will it actually generate any income? How will that income be shared? But it's quite astounding that when people are designing conservation interventions, so few actually do use a theory of change and actually make explicit what their assumptions are, and even challenge their own assumptions, and therefore perhaps change the design of their project. People tend to sort of launch into things without actually thinking, how am I actually thinking that's going to work in practice? And if that bit of the chain doesn't hold true, how do I change it so that the other bits can still deliver its outcomes? So just to give an example of another case where we've used a theory of change approach, we've been working again on engaging communities in tackling illegal wildlife trade, and using a theory of change, a sort of generic theory of change, to think about different mechanisms for engaging communities and incentivizing them to tackle illegal wildlife trade. So that might be because you introduce heavy law enforcement, or it might be that you introduce some kind of conservation enterprise element and they get benefits from it, so they're therefore motivated not to get engaged in illegal wildlife trade. It might be that you reduce human-wildlife conflict so that there's no retaliatory killing of wildlife. There's all sorts of pathways that you can take. And then you think through the assumptions as to how those things actually work. And what we did was look at a number of illegal wildlife trade initiatives, and we talked to the designers of these initiatives and tried to understand their theories of change, whether these were written down somewhere in a nice diagram or whether they were just a theory of change in their head, but really tried to understand their logic of how this thing was going to work. And then talk to the communities who were the ones that were part of this initiative and asked them what their theory of change was. We obviously didn't put it quite in that language, but what was their sort of mental map of how the project was working with them to not get engaged in illegal wildlife trade. And it was fascinating comparing the two and finding that actually they were completely different. That the way project implementers thought some of these initiatives was working was completely different to how the community thought it was going to work and how they were reacting to it. So, just to take an example, a wildlife conservancy in the Masai Mara and the tourism operator who was driving an initiative to lease land from a local community, pay them a significant amount of income for leasing that land on the basis that he could run his tourism business from there. And the deal with them was that there would be no illegal activities within the conservancy area. And his theory of change was, I'll give them the money, they won't do the illegal activities, I'll run my tourism business, and by the effect of that will be a decrease in illegal wildlife trade because we'll be there and we'll have guards on site, etc., etc. He talked to the community about it, and they said, oh yeah, no, yes, he gives us the money, and yes, we do X, Y, and Z. Of course, if there's been a drought year, then we go back into the conservancy and we graze our cattle there, and then we might be a little bit of snaring for bushmeat, and all these other things might happen. So, they had a completely different understanding of how the system was working. And it was only when we sort of brought the two sides together to discuss their differences that they could kind of work out a way where, both sides were happy with a slightly modified approach to the intervention. But I think without getting the two sides to spell out their theories and their assumptions about how things worked, it's impossible to understand why some of these conservation interventions fail. So I guess my final thought, which kind of takes us back to the questions here that are on the slide, is how many of us really do use this kind of approach, even if we don't necessarily try and formally articulate a theory of change and use it as the basis of monitoring and evaluation. When we're designing conservation interventions, how often do we actually sit down and think backwards from the outcome that we're trying to achieve to the intervention that we're putting in place, and think through what are the logical steps along the way, and crucially, what are the assumptions that are underpinning those steps, and are they really going to hold true? So I'll leave it there. I just think that's I'd be interested to hear from participants as to how many people sort of go through that process of thinking in that way, but also just to think that if people don't, the resources that have been presented here and the advice that's there on how to use this kind of approach, I think will be hugely useful. So I really do hope that there will be a lot of learning from this exchange and from this learning platform. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dilys. I think we'll hold Dilys's points and take two questions from the field, or I don't know where they are actually. So outside of Washington is the field, right? So Hasita will, I guess, read the questions online, and then the team can start to think about how you'd like to respond or address those questions. Then I have my 57 questions that I have answered. There's three, because I already asked one. Okay.
So we have a question from Tom Buck, who works at Resonance, and his question kind of relates to what Tim mentioned earlier, which is, can the USAID team speak to scale? The elephant in the room is really about reaching scale for conservation enterprises. So what lessons can be pointed out to, achieving that scale? And we also have Laura Cooper, who I'm going to unmute because she has 2 questions. And Laura, if you could just try and sort of see if your microphone works and go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. I have 2 questions. Sorry, I'm Laura Cooper Hall from the Population Reference Bureau. And at the Population Reference Bureau, we work a lot on population health, environment, and development activities and projects. One thing I've really appreciated during this presentation are all these tools that have been developed and these resources. So my first question is, were these tools kind of thought up out of thin air, or did you adapt other tools that existed from other types of projects in order to create the theory of change, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework, the learning agenda, all of those pieces? And do you think they could be adapted further for other types of integrated projects? And my second question, especially considering our work on population health, environment, and development, a lot of what has been said during the presentations on conservation have really resonated with some of the activities we support. And I was wondering if, amongst other health outcomes, you mentioned the health outcomes from the clean cook stoves, if there were other health outcomes that came up or were discussed in different projects in different communities that link to sexual and reproductive health and rights and access to family planning potentially. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for those questions. And Hasita has one more.
There's one more question here. So it's David. I'm not sure which organization he's from, but David basically asks, many conservation enterprise interventions are a subcomponent of projects and not a project in itself. Right. So, are you suggesting that the projects be designed with an idea of having conservation enterprises, considering the limited financial resources available as projects themselves?
Okay, so back to the team.
That's a lot of questions. I do have ideas for how to respond to most of those. I think the scale issue is one that's really important, but I don't think it has to be an either-or question. I don't think you work just with communities or at a bigger scale. A lot of the places where biodiversity is also very rural, and so working with local communities is really important. But I think from what Judy found in the retrospective was that a lot of the support evolves over time. And so what might be a backbone organization like an NGO supporting a community, that NGO's role evolves over time and they become more like what are now in Nepal and in Guatemala. They're much more, this more upstream kind of integrator association. So we have actually Natropal, growing to represent so many communities in the Philippines. Himalaya Biotrade in Nepal is really a collector of natural products that are then able to sell to markets like Aveda in the United States or other Estee Lauder companies. So there is a role, I think, for supporting that more upscale collector organization or lead organization, depending on your terminology. USAID is also...
Somebody online needs to mute. It's okay. We got it. Thanks.
Experimenting with a new funding mechanism in Brazil where we've basically catalyzed an investment fund so that other businesses that are doing natural product businesses in the Amazon can then apply for low interest loan credits for that level. So not everything has to be at the community, but I think you can neglect or avoid that community because that's where the biodiversity is. And a big part of USAID's role as a development organization is to work at that level as well. Do you have anything on that question, Judy?
I'm going to have the same answer.
Okay. So scale, adopt tools.
Something on this. Can I just add something on the scale issue?
Sure.
Yeah, Dylan.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Just to say, I completely agree with what you just said. And just because communities are small and quite often you're working with individuals, it doesn't mean that lots of small things can't add up to something big at scale. So I think that is the way forward, is these kind of regional or associations and cooperatives where you're bringing together lots and lots of small things, but then working that up at a big scale. So I think another good example of that is the FAO Food and Farm facility where, again, they're providing support to lots and lots of small-scale forest edge producers, but at that level where you're working through cooperatives, regional associations, and sort of tiered layers of scale, and really having an overall huge impact, but that filtering down to lots and lots of very tiny impacts with real people on the ground.
Another way that people are reaching scale is through diversifying. So we're finding they might start small with one type of non-timber forest product enterprise, but then they begin to scale by diversifying into other enterprise types as they become more business savvy. That's another way of scaling.
Definitely. I think for the question on adopting tools, I would say yes, I think this is very adoptable. I'm struggling to answer the question, did we develop it out of thin air?
I don't think there's any original ideas anymore. I don't know. I haven't had one for a long time.
Yes, I think yes and no. I mean, the theory of change is not a new approach for us, and so we adapted it to meet kind of our programming cycle needs. When it comes to some of these assumptions and the outcomes, I mean, you can see we've been working on this for a long time. Some of those projects go back 30 years. So yes, a lot of those concepts were definitely out there 30 years ago. So I don't think they're anything new. I think what's new potentially at USAID is turning this into a learner-driven exercise and really trying to engage our missions and our staff in the field and coming up with this learning agenda that involves them. And what are your challenges? What are your questions? How do you want to improve what we do? So that part might be a little bit new. After working on this at USAID for several years, I have a much greater appreciation for the role of monitoring and evaluation, to be honest. I don't think it has to be this rote, kind of boring, standardized exercise. I think that is how you get better at what you do. And if you really pay attention to what you're, what you monitor gets managed, or whatever that phrase is, that is how you can actually focus your energy and your resources and your time on what matters instead of what you have to report up for some other database. And that actually is one of our bigger challenges at USAID, is to get out of this mentality of, I have to, monitor up to a big system who's got system level kind of objectives and indicators versus what do you need to manage and monitor at a project and activity level to demonstrate impact. And that those two things don't have to be at odds with each other. They just have different purposes and serve different functions. And so that is kind of a mentality change within USAID that we're definitely struggling with. You had asked a question about uptake, and I just wanted to say within USAID staff, because that really is our target audience primarily for a lot of this stuff, when we had this conference this summer, we were all like, well, okay, we have this great idea. If we build it, will you come? And so, part of our role with measuring impact here is to take these tools, and we weren't really quite sure what we were going to get out of that exercise, and that's what Judy discovered in the end. And we probably could have made 15 or 17 of those posters, and we ended up with 12, but we could have had more. But we also realized in doing that exercise, they love to share and they love to learn from each other, and we like this community, but the message that we were trying to convey through this exercise in terms of M&E didn't necessarily come through really well. And so it was the discussion that we had, and we were constantly pushing our people to talk about, what are you actually measuring? And then even at the end of our conversation, it was, but we couldn't possibly measure all of these things. And no. So it is very much an internal change process that we are working on, but because of the positive sides of our culture of wanting to share and learn, and there has been really good engagement, but I think we're guiding folks along the way to do something that might not come naturally to them, or what some of our systems don't really allow you to do.
Right. Okay, good. That's a good answer, but I want to take it one step further. And this isn't necessarily your job or your goal. As you said, you have a goal of reaching people in USAID, but the people who are online generally are not. They're GWP. Yep. So we have a wider audience of people who are listening. So I guess my question is, it's a question that's constantly asked in the bank, is what's your what's your dissemination strategy?
Sure.
Right?
Well, like
and, you know,
this.
this
like
is
this,
good, but
this
this is 25 plus 20, so that's
Sure.
45. How do you get to 45,000? And maybe again, that's not your job, but how to make it relevant and accessible to project designers. I noticed that you had a whole bunch of documents: 2016, 2017, 2018, and I'm not a conservation practitioner every day, but I never got an email about any of these. I don't social media, so I couldn't have tweeted it. But the question is, I mean, is there a way to make it a little more widely spread than just the USAID community? And GWP has a website that apparently more people reach, and you have a website that a lot of people reach. So I don't know, is there a way to tweet these out so that people in the world know and get tweeting. Anyway, so it's just a question. And again, I'm not trying to make work for you. I'm just trying to say. And the flip side of that question is that no one who does this actually has time to read, because they're helping communities keep their goats protected from tigers. Yeah. So if you've got 5 documents of 100 page each over 4 years, it's a gigantic amount to assimilate for one guy who's trying to design one project in one place. So anyway, if you can help me with the reading challenge.
Well, that is why we have the checklist, for example.
The checklist was nice and short. I could almost read it.
We call that a job aid, and it was really meant to be something that people who might be designing projects, or perhaps they're in the middle of one of these bigger projects like you mentioned, because that is often what happens. But it was meant to just guide them through a process of going through it logically, and it's pretty short. So if you can't do that, then
maybe you shouldn't be trying to conserve.
You might have to examine your work habits.
Right. Okay. I have to examine my work habits.
The issue about it being a sub project within a bigger project, I don't think we're trying to say you have to just focus on this by itself, because actually one of the findings was
major finding
is
always part of a larger strategy conserving biodiversity.
But that said, it is a process, and it does require resources, and $40,000 as a throwaway for your honey is not going to get you anything more than $40,000 worth of results. And so that is also that internal change that we were trying to go through.
You mean tacking on a $40,000 small project onto $1 million project isn't really very helpful?
Probably
it's
not.
Helpful for a year or two, and then it goes away.
Not unless you're really maybe only working on one of those enabling conditions that you've identified as a problem.
Yeah.
And that would that might be a way to help it, but longer term, because it is a process of getting people to do that, so you have to approach it not in a 4 or 5 year cycle, but potentially a 20-year cycle, knowing that things might change along the way, markets might change, so that you have to stay on top of things like that. So that was, I think, answering that project or sub-project question.
I have something.
Go ahead.
On something that's I found really interesting, and within USAID and outside as well, as many times conservation enterprises are thought of as what you could call a bridge approach. So basically, the intention isn't that they're trying to change behaviors that are linked to biodiversity, but it's a way to get people to buy into a larger conservation strategy. And I didn't explore that deeply, but I think it deserves more exploration, because I think there's certain risks involved in using livelihoods as a bridge strategy. But I hear that a lot, quite frequently. Yeah.
I think one of the concerns that I have on a lot of our approaches is we make people just a little less poor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So like with the
right.
So
we talk about
poor.
sharing prosperity, not making less people less poor. But how do you do that?
How do you do that? And so, like the example that we showed in Guatemala, they do have great biophysical data that shows that the community forestry enterprises are both better off from income and an environment than the others, but they have a high value resource in mahogany. Where in the same area, community concessions with lower value timber are having much harder time in addressing that problem and the distribution of the benefits and the prosperity that you show, I think, is really important. But
and how much are people willing to pay for honey that they can't get access to, right?
So again, it's not a panacea, that it is multiple strategies. But it can also be, and the flip side of this example is the site that Judy visited in the Philippines, where people just recognize that we are making a subsidy that is potentially less than the cost of other conservation strategies, right? So that enterprise in the Philippines is not profitable, probably will never be profitable, but it has created a conservation constituency and changed attitudes for people where they value the forest. And then some of these co-benefits that we talk about, you asked about health benefits. In this case, it was an education benefit where this kind of $20,000 subsidy that's gone into this community enterprise has basically changed people's attitudes, created the conservation constituency, and then also led to education of nearly every child in that community. And so it was a process of development in the community that led to other income, other co-benefits or other outcomes, but was based off of something that you could see as a subsidy in reality.
That's the Callahan Reserve in Nueva Vizcaya, Philippines.
Okay, that was good. It's 10 o'clock, and I just commenting on the subsidies and these extra benefits. I mean, when we design these M&E frameworks, obviously you have to have both things in there, right? Because it is a public good, the conservation, so it deserves some subsidy, right? Speaking as an economist, right? It'd be nice if enterprises were profitable, or at least
that's the thought.
At least cover their costs, right?
Yeah.
A guy who was here yesterday who said, "We work for a nonprofit, but my management requires that I also say that doesn't mean at any cost, right?
Yeah.
You know, we have to cover our costs. We don't make a profit, but we also don't want to lose money. Anyway, so if you can get them not to lose money, then that would be good, and educate their children.
I mean, they just had a lower value product, right?
Yeah.
So.
And there's 5 or more.
Now it's
online.
become 7, but we have some time because
There's
it goes on to 10:30.
There's half an hour left.
Yeah.
Exactly. I just want to give everybody kind of a milestone. It's half an hour left. So sharpen your questions up.
I
And
want to address one about the health outcomes.
Oh yeah, go ahead and do that.
And I was trying to go through my little file cabinet of a brain, thinking of some health outcomes from some of the enterprise approaches. But I what I saw most frequently is that the enterprise approach incentivized the protection of the forest that was used for collecting for subsistence purposes. So fuel wood, or this woman collecting an herb that they eat in the slide. So they are co-benefits to the enterprises stemming from the incentives provided through the enterprise to protect the community forests, right?
so they're getting better nutrition and access to
Access to resources within the
But
community
generally,
forest.
that's not something that's measured in these projects, presumably, right?
Well, they try. We are trying to have people measure the non-cash benefits because many times they are as important
Vastly
as the cash
larger.
benefits. Yeah, even larger than the cash benefits. But the intention of an enterprise group.
Okay, start with the yes or no questions, and
Well,
we'll
there
get
are
those out
none
of
of
the way.
those, but there are some interesting ones. So our GWP Zambia project had a question, and they basically said, have there been any studies that have looked at community forest groups or community resource boards, because in Zambia they have that, as a basis for establishing conservation enterprises. So, and then he follows up with what kind of support is given to communities to be able to enter into negotiations with potential investors. So that's our GWP Zambia group. Thank you for that question. We have Jeremy, who's asked a question on the gender angle and the gender perspective of this. M&E are the main direct beneficiaries of conservation enterprises women.
That's a yes or no question. Good.
That could be a yes or no question. Okay, then one more question, and then I'll stop, and then we take the next 3. Is what is the experience in involving local communities and associations in M&E and be active in collection and analysis of data, thereby developing their capacity in the field, particularly on participatory M&E, and also a better understanding of the success of livelihood and conservation outcomes in the long term. And that is our very own Anders who has asked that question from the bank.
Oh, our very own Anders. Okay.
Yes,
All right,
our
she's
M&E
the M&E
specialist.
specialist for a really large group
Yeah.
of people.
So take those 3 and then...
So just quickly, give the group a chance to think. The people in the room, I haven't given you a chance to comment, but I think some of you are associated with the project, so maybe your questions have all been answered. But anyway, anybody else?
Yes.
Okay, so we do want to queue up some people just to put you online that you're next, okay?
Sure. I want to make a plug for the document that we shared that was called the retrospective for 20 years. A lot of the questions that, the 3 kind of lumps of questions that you just asked, Hasita, are found in more detail in that retrospective. I think the comments that I wanted to address, especially on the Guatemala case, was the gender benefits of that, and then also in Nepal. And that is, I'm not saying all of the time, but most often the time the enterprises deal with kind of women's work. The Nepal example that we showed you was a paper collection initiative, and that was actually in a village that I think it took Judy 2 days just to get there. And climbing up in the mountain, and the people who were doing this collecting were actually the poorest of the poor, and they were doing it because they had absolutely no other option. And so that also monitoring what you do in a community when you do that kind of intervention, because you, especially in this example of Guatemala, there's a great photo in the retrospective of a woman who was actually the leader of the forestry concession, and she took the job because the previous president had been assassinated over conflicts over the forest. And they nominated her to be the president because they felt like they wouldn't kill a woman. So that
She agreed with that.
she agreed to take the job because of that. So that is to say that it is, I think, on us as funders and project implementers to monitor the social impacts of what happens when you change the dynamics in a community with increasing income, because we have this biodiversity conservation goal, but there's also those social impacts. And I think that most of our interventions, I can say that I think we've had an empowering impact. And when you educate or provide income to a woman, that woman will make choices that benefit families and benefit social outcomes, whether that be education in the Philippines, which actually really came through in that retrospective, or in that social cohesion and governance as in the community in Guatemala. And I would make a plug for our kind of cooperator on that program. We presented last year here at the Land and Poverty Conference about the in-depth monitoring and research on benefits that they've done through C4, DITMAR?
Yeah.
Through C4 to actually measure the income and then also just the attitude change and social impacts of that enterprise. Judy, did you have anything to those to add?
Zambia gender and local community.
Oh, the
role
board
in
issue, yeah.
data.
Very much the organization structure, will vary from community and from country, but there are often those kinds of associations. In Guatemala, it is a community associations that manage those forestry concessions.
I also think that is sort of related to what we were talking about, the other co-benefits. So governance is also a strong co-benefit of taking an enterprise approach, because without strong governance, the enterprise falls apart if it's not perceived as fair. They're usually these community organizations are deciding on the benefit distribution among the communities. You can actually have, we found like in the case of Uganda and the gorillas, kind of a backfire effect if it isn't perceived as fair. Some people might retaliate. It's worse than just non-participation. They actually take action because they don't perceive that the benefit distribution is fair if it's not organized well through the governance structure.
I think that there's great opportunity to work with those kind of resource organization boards like you're talking about in Zambia. Some of our work in Central America has worked with water boards, just because water as a resource leads to great conflict if you don't have enough of it, and also crosses so many jurisdictions that there are often kind of organizational structures around water that is a good entry point into other natural resource management priorities. One last idea that had come up to me after a question that you had asked Tim was about just scaling and impact and who our audience is. We have limited funds of trying to make this kind of internal change within USAID, and so we have to be very focused on our target audience sometimes. But we also wanted to be able to share through events like this and through our website our documents about what we're doing, and a lot of it is just by having these kinds of face-to-face conversations, because I love nice documents. I love our retrospective especially, but it's probably over 50, 60 pages, and I know that most people, unless you're really into the topic,
we want to make them 200 pages long, which is a guarantee that
sure. But we also, because we sent Jason Houston, this professional photographer, who was actually able to go to all of these sites with Judy and make this photo documentation. On our website, we also have a story that uses, what's the platform name again, Judy? The ArcGIS. ArcGIS, to where we put together a
Photo
photo
maps.
story that we hope is a little bit more engaging and maybe a quicker summary. I think it might take you 15 minutes to go through the story and see all of those photos. But just trying to illustrate what we're doing was one of our objectives.
Photos and maps are
from the
good.
beginning.
Just before you go further, Hasi, do we have the capacity to send these links to the GWP community, right?
We do, and I've already sent the
and
that's
USAID
been done.
conservation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
But
you.
after the meeting, I will share the presentation, the video recording, and any other resources
Okay.
links.
Thanks. So, do you want to say something else? We had a question in the room, and I'm not sure you guys have questions, so maybe we'll do 3 in the room.
Well, there was the local community collecting data question, which I think is intriguing, and I am not an expert in that area, but Dilys brought this up when she was after the presentation about how there were many documents in the white and gray literature that were about the topic of alternative livelihoods, but little of them reported the outcomes in a way that could be taken up in the systematic review. You know, they do a critical appraisal of the analysis, whether it should be included, you know, whether it's reliable enough data. And I'm wondering, Dilys, if you see a solution to this coming from, you know, from the generation of reliable information, evidence from projects, or even collaborating with local communities to get reliable data that can be eligible for synthesis in a systematic review, or is that too large of a gap to bridge at this point?
Was that a question to Dilys?
Yes.
I'm not sure if that's in our program. All right.
I don't have an answer
Just
to the
check our
question, so
publication
I'm
list.
tossing
All right.
it back.
So, Dilys, if you could quickly try to respond. We do have 3 questions in the room, and it's now 10:11.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was saying I don't think we should get too hooked up on what data is or isn't available, particularly for systematic reviews, because they're quite stringent in the kind of data that they require. Yeah. But I do think donors are getting better at requiring better monitoring and evaluation. And I think all kinds of different types of impact evaluation, whether it's participatory monitoring or kind of PhD standard impact evaluations, are becoming more and more common. So I think the answer is just to encourage that wherever we can, whether that's through sort of donor requirements or through this kind of peer-to-peer learning and spreading tools and simple approaches, and encouraging measurement in whatever form is appropriate for the conditions.
Okay, great. So we'll start in the room. You had a question?
I did.
And say your name, maybe, since we're right here.
Come close to the
Oh,
microphone.
yeah, the microphone.
Sorry,
Yeah,
the
so
microphone's a bit tricky.
You can stand right here, that's fine.
Hi, I'm Hannah Fairbank. I work in the biodiversity team at the Global Environment Facility and a former member of the USAID office from which this amazing work comes from. So first thing I wanted to say is I'm so excited for you guys and really proud of this work. This is amazing. So great job. And just a couple of quick reflections and then one question. So as a donor, I see so much presumed magic going on between enterprises and presumed biodiversity
We work
outcomes.
with indigenous communities.
Yeah, so this work in terms of articulating theories of change is incredibly important because so often the magic is not happening. So it's really important to understand it. And just in terms of scale, I mean, agreeing with Dilys, one key entry point is obviously the donor community, and having things like this checklist and this MENL framework is wonderful for busy people who want to do the right thing and know something's missing in project reviews, etc. So thank you so much. I can't make any commitments on the behalf of my institution, but personally this is really helpful to my work. So I guess one of the things I'm so excited about is the retrospective element of the work you all did. And my question is, as a follower of the BCN and the Biodiversity Support Program and then all of the work that's happened since then, was there something that really surprised you about your findings now? Some of it feels like, oh my goodness, we still haven't learned these same lessons.
Basically.
I just want some reflection on what really surprised you, what excited you, what disappointed you in looking back. Thanks, you guys.
Okay, two more in here,
let's take
so you
some more
can think
questions.
through.
Hello everyone. My name is Jim Safa. I'm the CEO of Futures Agribusiness. It's a US-based company. We are in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we work mostly in Africa. So we are a project management firm. So basically, we work in Central Africa region, in the Congo Basin. In terms of conservation, we have been developing activity on the ground. So we came here to learn about what is going on, how things are going, so that we can see how maybe it's a way of collaboration. Actually, we recently signed an agreement with the 11 country ECAS, Central African countries, including DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, into Chad, Sao Tome and Principe. So that around. Basically, this agreement came from the fact that we developed, a model, a proof of concept on the ground on what we call sustainable cocoa in Cameroon. The sustainable cocoa is growing cocoa under the trees, and making sure that we care about not only soil conservation but in forests and and natural resources as well. So we developed that in collaboration with the Concordia. They just have the recent summit, some Concord summit in New York. So we develop those concepts and implement on the ground. And then self-sponsor, that is, we develop a strategy of mobilizing, resources locally to self-support those concepts, not so that we develop, and then we've been looking around and trying to see how we can implement and scale up. And then we have two challenges. It's the first, the market. As you mentioned, that it is profitable for a community, but the market access is still challenging for us to see where we can sell that specific cocoa. Sell coffee that we grow. Agroforestry techniques, innovative, and then that's why. By doing that and by showing that in the local media, as you mentioned, that how can you share what you guys are doing? The Central African community came and said, hey, can we stand together and work on our own agricultural portfolio? While we was actually developing their model, the ECAS 11 country came again and said, hey, please include us on your concept. So that's why we're working right now. And we're just trying to see, stand social to see how we can open doors of collaboration. So we have a lot of things to do, a lot of things that we've done already that we can share and how we have to implement.
So your questions about collaboration, partnership.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. My name is Chris Seek. I'm with Southern International. We're a tourism consulting company working with the World Bank and USAID. Just want to thank you guys for putting out this content. It's extremely valuable. I've used it in the field. I've literally had your webinars recorded and used it as case studies, so it's extremely useful for us in the field. I guess my questions are, one is, I feel like a lot of the projects are designed very well, recognizing that just creating an enterprise isn't going to result in conservation. And there's a lot of kind of, this theory of change is mapped out, and great conservation organizations who know the indirect threats and the direct threats. And so that's all very well designed. But when we go in to create the enterprise, there's no effort whatsoever to kind of measure those. So never once have we been asked to measure communities' attitudes towards, poaching and things like that. So it goes back to this measurement question of, if we design a project and then we go out and create the enterprise, why are we not including these types of activities in order to measure difference in attitudes and these kind of things? And then my other question on this is looking at the role of the private sector. The person on the call has mentioned that the private sector is very critical, especially with tourism. And there's dozens of tour operators internationally, locally, that want to get involved in this type of development work. They do so because this type of product is core to who they are. It's what the customers care about, and they want to show that they're giving back to the communities. But I feel like it's, we're talking a lot about private sector engagement, but there's not really a clear mechanism of how to bring in their expertise. I think a lot of donors think of the private sector as someone who will come with a check, and most tour operators I know do not have the ability to write a check. But what they do have is expertise. They can look at a product and say, yeah, that makes sense. I think that will sell. I can help you sell this. I'll take it back and start selling it. But I think as I try to engage, like USAID missions are like, wait, we're going to pay for their plane tickets to come over here. It's like a question of, is that the right use of project funds if we're doing conservation work? And so this question of how do we engage the private sector? And then the last thing related to this is scale. And I think of all the projects I've worked on, a lot of conservation enterprises that are small are nice. And, again, you're making people a little less poor sometimes. But when I worked in Namibia and saw the results of the LIFE project and this whole enabling conditions to create these conservancies and concessions where you create joint ventures where we say from stakeholders to shareholders, where the community actually owns that lodge and they're making money from every guest that's coming to that area. But that's high reward, high risk. And it's very complicated to put those deals together. And I feel like a lot of projects don't want to go down that path. They'd rather work with dozens of small enterprises than risk everything for that one big kind of lodge. And USAID's done it in certain places. I know there's some great examples of this, but again, at USAID, World Bank's in this situation too. Is like, how do we do this, and how do we facilitate actual large scale investment that has conservation goals in mind, where the community is actually at the table and partner in that. And I just don't feel like the development community has figured that out, at least in tourism, of how we can go about using these projects to do that.
Okay, so back to the team, and then there's still some questions.
Yeah, there are a few, but go ahead
Okay,
and answer
maybe
this.
getting to the end of it.
I-
My scale question was asked by someone else, so my
Great.
question was
So I'll take Hannah's questions first. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here. I think what surprised me are 2 points. One, what surprised me was the fact that donors in general, like whoever goes back and does retrospectives, okay? Not very many. You do.
It's a sad story. I think we spend way too much money on it.
Oh, nobody does. Nobody does retrospectives. And so for me, it was both surprised and made me very happy to be able to support Judy. Judy had the best job the year that she did this, I have to say. Through some really challenging
You didn't
times.
just read the documents.
I read the documents first, then I
It was a very a difficult logistical challenge, I think, and a lot of time spent away from her family. But to be able to go back and document mainly the co-benefits, and I know this is near and dear to Hannah's heart, but it wasn't just the biodiversity benefits that we saw, which was our goal and why a lot of those initiatives had started, but it was those the gender impacts, the education impacts, the socio governance impacts of those initiatives. That was a kind of a reminder to me of how important that is. And then the other thing that really stood out to me, and I would like to say it surprised me, but it didn't, and that was that there weren't any real new concepts found. If you go back to BCN, back in the 90s, we are still talking about a lot of the same things in the BCN. But what I hope we're doing now, at least at AID, is we're trying to take some more of that and putting more money behind what we already know and to do it right and to really make that internal change for external impact. And how we go about it. And it is a slow slog, and we're having to keep investing in it. And by launching this MENL framework and by making offer of TA support that our office, the central office, is paying for, but we will go and help our programs in the field uptake some more of this M&E strategy as a way of creating that change. And just quickly to address the other 2 questions, I've had on my list our agriculture folks, which we call the Bureau for Food Security, as kind of my next target. Like I do biodiversity, I'm 100% biodiversity, but I think a lot of what we're doing here is really applicable to that biodiversity agriculture interface. And so welcome the collaboration, welcome the support. We definitely speak a different language, and I'm having to deal with terminology differences between agriculture folks and the biodiversity folks. But I think the concepts are still valid, and really hope to do that more. So both the agriculture folks and then also like our hardcore M&E folks are also kind of my next target. We have a program at USAID that's called the Measuring our M&E Cap Fellows, Monitoring and Evaluation Fellows, to where it might not be a biodiversity employee in the field, but they do M&E, because I find that when you show an M&E specialist the theory of change and some of this stuff, they get it. They're 100% with you really quickly, and so those are kind of my internal change agents that I want to hit up next.
And what was Anders' question? Was related to what she's just.
It was the data.
Sorry, Anders is our M&E
Oh,
specialist.
sure, and I'd love to talk with you more, Anders, at some point, and help you do your internal change as well, if that would be helpful to you. We would love to talk with you. And then, Chris, thank you very much for coming. I've admired your work from afar for many years, and many of your staff I'm also very fond of. But I wanted to say a lot of the work that USAID is doing now is looking more at that impact investing level, and including tourism when we can do that. I agree with every comment that you made, in that it is a risky business, but we are trying to take the stakeholder to be a shareholder and really make that investment. USAID has launched a new private sector engagement strategy, so it's not just about making that partnership, but really figuring out how we can harness what the private sector knows how to do really well. Partly it's just the basic fact in a lot of our evaluation criteria from your awards, we keep funding the conservation organizations to do the work when we know that they don't have the business skills or the business mission even to do that. And so how do we change just ourselves and make sure that before we fund something that there's that private sector expertise. And I know of the work that you've done in actually creating a market or creating a product maybe where it doesn't exist. And so just because the community in Ethiopia might not have the skills right now, they might have something that's really valuable and that can be developed. And I think that's a lot of our challenges as well. And realizing whether it's ecotourism or creating a new cocoa product to sell or a new paper product, how we can harness that capability and capacity of a market to further our goals. So.
Okay, thank you.
I did mention
it's
the
10:25.
Amazon.
I just wanted to make
the
sure.
Amazon
I'm not sure if
fund.
our camera's going to go off at 10:25.
It won't go off at 10:20, but
Okay.
people won't go. We should.
People will go,
We will
yes.
stop. Yeah, I think.
Somebody's waiting outside the door, so we need to.
No,
be
we
there.
won't have anybody waiting for
All
us
right,
to do
good.
that. Yeah,
So
yeah.
please continue.
I didn't know if you had any other question or you wanted to say something. So that's,
From the private sector.
Yeah, actually,
or what? Hannah's question.
Hannah's question about the surprises, it was how the conservation organizations that were supporting these enterprises had to develop the business savvy or get it somewhere. And so some of the most successful enterprises in terms of conservation outcomes were those that developed the lead firms that Megan mentioned. I think it would be really worthwhile to focus on what works and doesn't work with those lead firms higher up on the supply chain, because Forestcom in Guatemala and Himalayan Biotrade, it's amazing how they can act as aggregators, add value to product, and provide that market access. So I think that's something really to look more into. That was the biggest one.
Okay, good. So I just want to not completely wrap up, but you mentioned these successes and you went to the field and you saw these places. So sometimes the enterprise is successful in financial terms and sometimes it's successful in conservation terms.
And sometimes
not
not.
always the same. Okay, sometimes not. So I just want to close the thought. Phyllis, raised the point that a lot of these things fail. And so I want to give you the opportunity to say, yeah, but some of them succeed too. So is that true?
I think it depends.
Is
So
it more than half?
when we started developing the proposal for doing this retrospective, people said, well, we want to know, do they work or not? Do enterprises work or not? Are they successful?
Depends
Depends
what you
on
want,
how
right?
you define success. What are your desired conservation outcomes, right?
And
Or do you mean from a business sense, right? First, so that was what we've been discussing. First, you need to define what you mean. What is your theory of change, basically? And then the answer is always it depends. It's not.
Oh, come on.
It is, and so that's why we focused on the conditions, right? That
It's like an
lead that
economist,
seem
right?
to support these outcomes, or if they're not in place, create the barriers to these outcomes. And so that I don't think there's an answer. Are they successful or not? I think it really
Okay.
depends
There's
on the
different
context
species
and
of success,
Yeah,
and some are
totally.
better and worse than that.
That's right, and
But
yeah,
they're not all failures.
definitely not. all
Okay,
things.
good. Definitely not all failures.
I think it would be really interesting to look at some of them that didn't succeed in achieving, like they didn't last as enterprises, and they didn't achieve their desired conservation outcomes, and really dive into to why and see whether it
Or
is
did they
just
achieve something else that the community wanted to have? That
maybe some co-benefit that improved governance.
all people got all healthier or
But-
got more educated.
But what is it just the flip side of the conditions that we found, basically? That those conditions weren't in place, or are there other elements that contributed to the failure of those?
Okay, so you come back next October with those results.
Okay.
That'll be brilliant.
Megan?
Okay,
Well,
good.
thank you.
All right, so any other burning questions?
You think we could do one question, one quick one?
Okay.
It's only about the time scale, really. It's basically saying, do the presenters believe that the time limit of typical USAID projects and typical bank projects of no
Yes or
more
no
than
question.
5 years is a constraint to achieving both entrepreneurial and
Yes,
population
of
impact? I know, but Luis Ramos said this, and I thought I would just say it.
I say definitely, but I think some of the ones that we highlighted in the retrospective, some of them did get long-term support. Certainly the LIFE project that you mentioned, that was like 13-year investment. The Guatemala has been more than 20 years. And so, yes, the project cycle is a barrier, but there were some benefits to that as well, because as Judy noted, the role of these aggregators and the role of the donor changes over time. And so by renewing a project, we were, I think, many times able to refocus that support and evolve along with them, particularly in the Guatemala case. And right now, I would put in a plug for that, and to the extent that you work in Guatemala, I think the political situation, it is possible that we could lose all of that all of these resources and all of the impact to date, just based on that political will around will you renew these community concessions or not, and will you allow potentially problematic development to come in and erode what you've done, what you've succeeded.
I think that 5-year question is also useful to think about what you would put in the M&E framework. If in the first 5 years you don't have the grandest desire to create an enterprise that helps everybody and makes a profit, but at least sets up the conditions that would allow that to happen in the second 5 years, or
Exactly.
you know what I mean. So a little more realism, because often we write these things in extremely ambitious and grandiose ways, right? And then after 5 years, you go, "Oh wait, we didn't save the whole planet." So what should we maybe have said we would do? Just save this little part.
But then also just to recognize, but besides, yes, our donor cycle is important, but a lot of these elements of success on these long-term investments really came down to local leadership and the capacity behind that local leadership and finding those really good people and supporting them. And so whether you support them for 5 years or 10 years, a lot of it is by strengthening the people that are there and the structures that are there and just their leadership.
Well, I think a plug for the integrating it into a larger project, and also just the way the World Bank works is slightly different from the way USAID works. Having the government counterparts or the agencies that are responsible for that to be part of the deal somehow, so that they're not working actively against the conservation enterprise, which often happens, right? And not to say it has to be top down or designed top down, but at least the government has to be aware that this is an experiment, right? And after 5 years, we'd like to evaluate the experiment and then make conservation concession licenses routine instead of difficult, right? If the government is on board with that plan. So, anything else coming up? All the questions have been answered, and we're able to wrap up. And we're at 10:32. So, good. I'm happy to stay and chat if people want to. I don't know whether you want to turn this thing off. We can let people get back to their desks. I know some people are up late if they're in faraway places.
And I just wanted to add that we have regular monthly webinars. So if you would like to sign up to them, please email us at gwp-info@worldbank.org. And our next webinar is in November, and it's on human-wildlife conflict insurance schemes.
Interesting.
That should be interesting.
And so for
please
people
join.
who are looking online, the link to this conservation enterprise work is on the screen now, and Hasita is going to be sending that out to everybody. Thank you for participating and asking questions and learning together with us.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.